standing orders for first contact with the Eshari Compact were 43 pages long, and I had read every word twice before we crossed the outer boundary marker. That's not a boast. Every pilot aboard the Rendahl had done the same. Admiral Tessera ran a tight ship, and in the 6 weeks we'd spent crawling toward Eshari space at sublight. Close enough for radio, far enough to be polite. Her standing orders had become a kind of liturgy. You read them until the words lost meaning. Then you read them again. The core of it was this. Under no circumstances was any Terran vessel to power its weapons systems inside Eshari space. Not its active targeting arrays. Not its point defense grid. Not a single capacitor bank in any gun mount. The Eshari Compact was a machine intelligence. Not a hive. Not a council. Not a sovereign armada with an emperor somewhere who liked titles. A machine intelligence. 18 months of careful radio exchange had told us exactly what that meant. A civilization that ran on prediction. They modeled everything. Every trajectory, every system state, every probability curve. Their entire economy, their social architecture, their military doctrine. All of it built on the premise that given sufficient data, the next state of any system could be computed. Contact negotiations had proceeded through pure logic exchange. No metaphors, no cultural reference. Numbers and decision trees and formal proofs transmitted across 11 light weeks of careful silence, and the Eshari had responded each time with what our xenolinguistics team called elegant precision. They were not hostile. They were not warm. They were simply exact. The 43 pages of standing orders reflected all of that. You don't show weapons to a species that reads weapons as threat states and computes threat responses before you've finished raising the barrel. You don't maneuver unpredictably inside their space, because unpredictability is a category of aggression to a mind built on forecasting. You fly on declared vectors, at declared speeds, with declared intentions, and you do not deviate. Every movement we made had been transmitted to the Eshari 72 hours in advance. They knew where we were going. They knew how fast. They had acknowledged each transmission with a single compressed burst, a probability value, always greater than 0.99, meaning they had modeled our declared trajectory and found it consistent with stated intent. It was the closest thing to trust that a prediction-based civilization could offer a species they were meeting for the first time. I was a fighter pilot. Lieutenant Cale Morn, Fast Attack Wing, 3rd Flight, assigned to shuttle escort duties for the duration of the diplomatic approach. My skate, that's the designation for our forward intercept craft, a flat, broad-winged thing that looks nothing like a fighter ought to and flies better than anything I've ever put my hands on, was one of 6. Riding point on diplomatic shuttle Kestrel 3 as it made the final approach to the Eshari contact point. The shuttle carried Ambassador Priya Wen, 2 aides, 3 xenolinguists, and enough formal documentation to paper a moon. My job, and the job of the other 5 skates flanking the shuttle at half a kilometer out, was to be there. Not to engage anything, not to protect in any active sense. Just to be the shape of escort, the visual statement that the ambassador was important, and her importance was acknowledged in the way her civilization knew how to acknowledge it. Even to a machine's intelligence, we'd been told, the geometry of escort communicated something worth communicating. The Rendahl herself hung back 30,000 kilometers. A heavy carrier, she was not a subtle ship. 800 meters of layered hull plating, engine nacelles that burned amber in the dark, a command superstructure like a city block set on its end. She carried 6 squadrons and enough ordnance to reclassify a small moon. She was also, by explicit order, running cold, every weapon system dark, every targeting array offline. She was a shape in space, and that's all she was allowed to be. I remember thinking, on the morning of the approach, that the whole arrangement was sensible in an abstract way, but deeply uncomfortable in a personal one. You didn't tell a fighter pilot that the plane they were sitting in had no weapons, and then point them at an alien civilization, and ask them to look confident about it. My skate's gun pods were physically removed before we left the Rendahl's hangar deck. Not just powered down, removed. There were smooth mounting ports where the point defense clusters had been, and when I ran my pre-flight checks and saw nothing in those slots, I felt something I couldn't name exactly. Not fear, not embarrassment, just a specific kind of nakedness you don't want to feel on a first contact approach. The flight manifest called it a gesture of good faith. I called it unpleasant, and then kept it to myself, because you don't build a career in fast attack by being the pilot who complains about their loadout. But those were the orders, and I had agreed to follow them, and I am not the kind of person who follows orders reluctantly. I follow them or I don't fly. That's the arrangement, so I flew. The contact point was a region of empty space about 2U inside the Eshari outer boundary, equidistant from 3 of their deep space observation platforms. We had been told, through the radio exchange, that the platforms were not weapons platforms. The Eshari had transmitted full schematics. Our analysts had spent 6 weeks picking through them, and had concluded, with a probability value the Eshari themselves would have appreciated, that the structures were exactly what they were described as: sensor arrays and communication relays. Not armed, not fortified, just watching. The Eshari, apparently, were very good at watching. I got the first visual on them on approach. My skates pass sensors, passive only, per the standing orders, lit up the moment we crossed a certain threshold. The observation platforms were large. Not ship large, structure large. Each one was a lattice of interconnected geometric forms, regular and recursive, like a mathematical object made physical, and then scaled up until it filled a volume that a freighter could park inside. They didn't rotate. They didn't shift. They sat in space with a total stillness of a thing that had been placed somewhere on purpose, and had no reason to move. Their surface was a dark material that my sensors, as somewhere between composite armor and semiconductor substrate, a substance that absorbed energy and processed it, and did nothing else. No waste heat, no reactive emission, no sign that anything inside was paying attention. Everything inside was paying attention. That was the whole point of the Eshari. They were always paying attention. Morn to escort flight, visual on all 3 platforms. Anything from the passive arrays? Nothing active, Lieutenant. That was Sergeant Vela Ors, my 2, flying off my starboard quarter. She'd been flying with me for 2 years. She had the voice of someone who had seen enough things not to be surprised by most of them anymore. Which was what you wanted in a 2. They're watching us, but they're not painting us. Just observing. Keep it clean. No active emission from anyone. Ambassador shuttle is on approach vector, holding to declared speed. I checked my display. The shuttle was exactly where it was supposed to be, doing exactly what it was supposed to do. Everything according to the 43 pages. Kestrel 3, you have eyes on the platforms? Shh. Voice came back steady and precise. The voice of a person who had been in rooms with difficult entities before and had learned to make herself sound like the calmest thing in any given space. We see them. Continuing on vector. Xenolinguistics team is monitoring the Eshari broadcast channels. Understood. Escort flight is at declared position, holding. We flew in silence for 20 minutes. The shuttle crept toward the designated meeting point, an empty coordinate at the exact geometric center of 3 platforms, a place chosen by the Eshari and confirmed by our navigation team as having no tactical significance other than being equally far from everything, neutral ground, if empty space could be called ground. The Eshari had been specific about the coordinate, down to the 5th decimal place of each axis, and our navigation team had matched it precisely. When they had confirmed the match, the Eshari had acknowledged, with a probability value of 0.9994, Xenolinguist said, was the highest value they had yet transmitted in 18 months of exchange. The Eshari, apparently, found precision reassuring in a way they found little else. The first transmission from the Eshari arrived when the shuttle was 4 minutes from the meeting coordinate. It came on the agreed channel, in the agreed format, a mathematical preamble followed by a compressed data burst that our xenolinguistic systems unpacked in real time. What came out was not words exactly. The Eshari didn't do words in any human sense. What they did was state descriptors and probability fields, a language in which every statement was also a prediction, and every prediction was also a statement of current observed reality. Our team had spent 18 months building a translation protocol, and what the burst translated to, approximately, was this. Contact entity designated Terran diplomatic unit, current trajectory consistent with stated parameters, probability of Declared intent. 9971. Eshari observational array active. Preparation to engage designated contact protocol in progress. That's a welcome. One of the xenolinguists said over the shuttle channel. I could hear something that might have been relief in her voice, though she kept it professional. They're telling us they're ready. Acknowledged, the ambassador said. Proceed to meeting coordinate. I let out a breath I hadn't known I was holding and checked my position. Holding to declared vector. Everything clean, everything predictable. The Eshari observation platforms were still, and their sensor arrays were still passive. And somewhere inside those lattice structures was a machine intelligence that had just done the equivalent of shaking our hand. I thought, this is going to be fine. That was 4 minutes before it stopped being fine. What happened next was later classified, analyzed, scribed in 6 separate after-action reports, a formal board of inquiry, and Admiral Tessara's personal account she submitted to Fleet Command, and which I read when it was eventually declassified. All of those documents use careful language and probability assessments and conclusions drawn from partial sensor data. I was there to tell you what I saw. At 2 minutes and 40 seconds from the meeting coordinate, one of the Eshari observation platforms changed state. Not dramatically, no weapons emerged, no new structures deployed. But my passive sensors flagged a shift in its emission profile. Something inside the platform had powered up. Not a weapon array, not a targeting system, a broadcast array, a different one from the contact channels we'd been using. A band our analysts had not seen in any of the 18 months of prior exchange. Ors, I said. Are you reading that? Reading it. Not in the protocol catalog. Routing to Kestrel Tron 3's linguistics team. 14 seconds later, broadcast began. It was aimed at the shuttle, not at the escort flight, not at the Rendahl, not at anything else. The tight beam geometry put it squarely on Kestrel 3. Our linguistic systems tried to parse it and couldn't. Not a translation failure. The format itself was different. Where all previous Eshari communications had been in their formal state descriptor. Language, this was something else. Something older, or lower level, or more fundamental. The xenolinguists described it later as the difference between reading a letter and receiving a direct neural input. The Eshari weren't transmitting a message. They were transmitting a command state, the same way a master system issues an instruction to a subordinate process. Not a request, not an inquiry, not an exchange of information, a command. Ambassador Wen's voice came over the comm, and it was flat in a way I didn't like. Something is happening with our navigation systems. What kind of something? Our autopilot is receiving a correction input. From outside, we didn't authorize it. I felt the cold run across my shoulders that a pilot feels when something outside their control is touching their aircraft. Oars. Active sensors. I stopped myself. Standing orders. No active emission. The standing orders were still the standing orders. All flights? Position. Urge 3. Do you have manual override? We have it. We're taking manual. A pause. The input is persistent. Every time we override it, it reissues. The system is not taking no for an answer, Lieutenant. I understood then, in a way I hadn't before, what a machine intelligence that ran on prediction actually looked like when it decided to assert control. The Eshari had modeled the approach. They had calculated the shuttle's trajectory, its likely behavior at the meeting coordinate, probable decisions of its crew under various conditions. And somewhere in that calculation, something had flagged an inconsistency. Some parameter of the shuttle's state that didn't match the probability distribution they expected. And they had done what their architecture did when a prediction deviated from reality. They had issued a correction. Not a threat, not an attack, correction. As if the shuttle were a variable in an equation that needed to be resolved. The correction was benign in intent and terrifying in implication. They were editing us. Kestrel 3, break off approach, I said. Fall back to holding distance. Escort flight, form up on the shuttle. Wait. The ambassador's voice was sharp. We do not break off. We do not deviate from declared vector without transmitting intent. Those are the standing orders, Lieutenant. Ambassador, the Eshari are actively adjusting your navigation. I know what they're doing. I also know that an unannounced deviation from our declared vector is how this turns into an incident. We stay on the channel. We talk to them. I bit down on what I wanted to say, which was that talking to a machine intelligence that was currently issuing command states to your shuttle's navigation computer was not my preferred definition of a conversation. But the ambassador had the authority, and she was not wrong about the standing orders, and I was a fighter pilot, not a diplomat, so I held my position and I watched. What happened in the next 4 minutes was a negotiation I could only partially follow from outside. The xenolinguistics team aboard Kestrel 3 was working in real time, trying to interpret the Eshari command state broadcast, trying to understand what specific inconsistency had triggered the correction, what the Eshari were trying to fix, what they thought the shuttle should be doing differently. The reports I read later describe it as extraordinarily difficult work done with remarkable speed. At the time, from my cockpit, it sounded like controlled panic, voices overlapping, someone calling out frequency shifts. The linguistics AI spitting fragmented partial translations that dissolved before they could mean anything. The shuttle held its vector. The navigation corrections kept issuing. The Eshara observation platforms did not move. Then the second platform changed its emission profile. Second array is spinning up a broadcast band, or said. Same pattern, tight beam. This one's aimed at. A half-second pause that told me she'd checked twice before saying it. At us, Lieutenant. At the escort flight. Felt the hair on my arms stand up under the flight suit. Status on the Rendahl. Third platform's array is coming active. Chief Petty Officer Davan Rue, from the secondary flight position on my port side, 300 meters off. His voice had the particular flatness of a pilot who was deliberately not allowing his voice to carry what he was feeling. It's painting the carrier. All 3 platforms, all 3 arrays. The same not quite weapon, not quite communication broadcast now aimed at every Terran vessel in the vicinity simultaneously. Not a weapon. I kept telling myself that. Not a weapon, a correction protocol. They thought something was inconsistent about us, and they were going to fix the inconsistency. I keyed the fleet channel. Morn to Rendahl actual. Admiral Tessara's voice came back immediately. We're reading it, Morn. Stand by. Admiral. Their correction protocol is hitting us at the flight level now. If it reaches navigation in my birds. I understand. Stand by. I understood what standing by meant, and I understood why she was saying it. The standing orders. 43 pages of carefully constructed behavioral constraints, designed to keep a prediction-based machine intelligence from modeling us as a. Every pilot in the escort flight held position. The Rendahl held position. The shuttle held its declared vector. While the Eshari systems tried to redirect it, the correction broadcasts filled 3 tight beam channels simultaneously, and our systems tried to receive them without acting on them. Everyone stood by, and I sat in a skate with no gun pods and thought about the 43 pages. I thought about what I knew of the Eshari's architecture. Not the technical specifications. Those were above my clearance level. The general shape of it, as the xenolinguistics team had described it in the briefings, fiction-based intelligence, did not have a category for anomaly the way a human mind did. A human encounters an anomaly and files it under unexplained or surprising and moves on. An anomaly to a prediction engine was an active error state. It had to be resolved. The system would keep issuing corrections until the anomaly resolved, or until it ran out of correction protocols to try. The Eshari didn't have a setting for shrug and continue. Their architecture didn't include it, which meant the correction protocol was going to keep running. And if it escalated past navigation adjustments, if it moved to something more direct, we were going to have to make a decision about the standing orders that the standing orders hadn't anticipated. There is a paragraph in Admiral Tessara's standing orders. I remember its page and position because I had read it twice. As instructed, that addresses exactly this category of situation. Not this scenario specifically, because you couldn't have predicted this specifically, but this category. Civilisation adherence to the contact protocol had created a deadlock in which neither side could communicate effectively, and the situation deteriorating toward a state neither side intended. The paragraph was short. I can quote it approximately from memory because I had 2 minutes of silence in which to recall it precisely. That strict adherence to the contact protocol produces a state of systemic non-resolution. The senior officer present may exercise judgment. This is not a license for escalation. This is recognition that doctrine is a tool, not a law, and that the purpose of the contact protocol is a successful first contact, not the preservation of the protocol itself. A tool, not a law. I keyed the fleet channel again. Morn to Rendahl Actual. Go ahead, Morn. Admiral, I'm requesting permission to break standing orders. A silence that lasts exactly 3 seconds. In that 3 seconds, I ran through the request twice and decided it was the right one both times. Specify. The Eshari are running a correction protocol because we're behaving in a way their models can't resolve. The corrections are aimed at the shuttle and both flights and the carrier simultaneously. Their models are broken and they're trying to fix us because the data doesn't match the prediction. They don't understand why we're not what they calculated. I was talking fast and I made myself slow down. Admiral, they've never seen a Terran carrier in person. They have our transmitted specifications, but specifications are data. We've been flying, cold and running dark, and holding declared vectors because we didn't want to look threatening. We have 6 unarmed skates and an empty carrier and a shuttle that won't go where their models say it should. And from a prediction standpoint, that might look less S-like compliance and more like corrupted data. They might be correcting us because their models say a carrier that size should be hot, should be armed, should be exactly what it is, and instead it's quiet and quiet doesn't compute. I kept going because she hadn't cut me off. They aren't hostile. And they are malfunctioning because we gave them accurate specifications and then showed up and didn't match them. A cold, dark carrier with empty gun mounts looks like an error in the input. It doesn't look peaceful. It looks wrong. Prediction engine that encounters a wrong input has one response: correct it. Another silence. Longer. I could feel the Admiral thinking on the other end of that channel. And I had served under her long enough to know that her silences meant something, was being weighed, not that an answer was being delayed. What are you asking for, Lieutenant? I'm asking to light up the Rendahl. Not targeting, not fire control, just systems. Drive arrays, power grid, shield emitters on standby. Let her look like a carrier. Let her be what she is. Don't make the Eshari models resolve a discrepancy that we created by trying to seem smaller than we are. That will read as a power-up. Yes, ma'am, but it'll read as a true power-up, which is what she is. We've been showing them a dark ship and calling it a carrier. If their models can't reconcile the two, the correction protocol is going to keep running until they find something they can actually fix. And I don't want to be in this cockpit when they out of soft options. This silence lasted longer than the others. I watched the broadcast arrays on all 3 platforms continuing their steady emission. I watched the shuttle's position ticker on my display, holding stubbornly to declared vector despite whatever the Eshari systems were telling it. I thought about the ambassador on that shuttle, in a space where a machine intelligence was pushing against their navigation computer, like a hand pressing on a door that keeps swinging back. I thought about the 43 pages, and about the paragraph in the middle of them, and I waited. Rendahl Actual to all flights, Admiral Tessera said. I am authorizing a controlled systems activation. Drives, power grid, passive emitters. No weapons, no targeting, no fire control. Activation in 30 seconds. All flights hold position. Morn. You will observe and report on any change in Eshari emission profiles the moment you read them. Understood, Admiral. Thank you. Thank me yet. The 30 seconds passed very slowly. I watched the countdown on my display, and I watched the 3 Eshari platforms, and I watched the correction protocol transmissions still pushing steadily at everything they could reach. And I thought about what happens when you show a prediction engine exactly what you are instead of what you think it wants to see. Then the Rendahl lit up. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't a decloak or an emergence from stealth. The carrier had been visible the whole time, a dark shape against the stars, unmistakable in her mass and her profile. What changed was the quality of her darkness. The drive arrays came active, and the amber burn of her engine nacelles threw light across the lower hull, across the layered armor plating, across the gun mounts and sensor towers, and the long flat planes of the hangar deck bay doors. The power grid came up, and running lights appeared along her length, small steady points of white and amber and red, and the shield emitters, hum to standby, and put a faint atmospheric haze around her superstructure that your eyes registered before your brain. Process why. She became, in the span of 30 seconds, the ship she actually was, not a shape, a carrier. 800 meters of lived-in, armed, crude, functional military hardware that had been turned off and had now turned on. All of it real. All of it exactly what had been in the transmitted specifications. Nothing more, nothing less. I watched the observation platforms. 7 seconds after activation, the first platform's broadcast array changed frequency. Not off, changed. Correction protocol band went quiet and something else came on. Our linguistic systems picked it up and began parsing. At 12 seconds, the second platform's array shifted. At 19 seconds, the third. The ambassador's voice came over the comm, and I could hear something in it I hadn't heard before in any of the 14 months she'd been running this mission. The navigation corrections have stopped. All 3 arrays have changed bands, ORS confirmed. They're transmitting on the standard contact channels again. Linguistics is parsing. The translation came through 30 seconds later, and I read it on my display twice before I believed it. Contact entity designated Terran carrier unit. Current system state consistent with transmitted specifications. Probability of declared configuration 0.9988. Previous correction protocol terminated. Inconsistency resolved. Eshari observational array returning to baseline. Designated contact protocol resuming. I sat in my cockpit for a moment and didn't say anything. The Rendahl burned amber in the dark ahead of me, enormous and present, looking exactly like what she was. The 3 Eshari platforms were still and quiet, their correction arrays silent, their standard channels open again. The shuttle moved on its declared vector toward the meeting coordinate. Autopilot restored. Navigation clean. Inconsistency resolved. The shuttle completed its approach to the meeting coordinate without further incident. Followed. The formal first contact session lasted 11 hours, and I was not part of it. My flight circled the contact point at holding distance, while Ambassador Wen and her team and the Eshari exchanged protocols that our linguistics systems would spend the next 4 months fully translating. I was not in that room, metaphorically speaking. I was outside it in my skate, doing navigation checks to stay occupied, eating a ration bar at hour 3, listening to Sergeant Orrs complain quietly about her environmental controls at hour 7, watching Chief Petty Officer Rue fall asleep and then wake up and deny it at hour 9. There is a specific quality to the boredom of a holding pattern around a first contact event that I don't think I can explain to someone who hasn't sat in it. It is not ordinary boredom. Ordinary boredom is empty. This boredom had weight, the weight of something enormous happening at very close range to which you had no access and no contribution to make. Every few minutes, the linguistics AI aboard my skate would throw a fragment of a parsed Eshari transmission across my secondary display. Raw strings of state descriptors that made no sense without the full translation context, and I would read them and understand nothing and file them away. At hour 2, I tried to reconstruct from the fragments I'd seen the Eshari might be saying. At hour 2.5, I gave up because I was not a xenolinguist and my reconstructions were fiction and I had a 6-hour holding pattern to fly. I thought about the correction protocol instead. I kept coming back to it. The clinical precision of it, the absence of anything that could be called hostility or intent. A machine intelligence encountering an anomaly and issuing a correction. The shuttle's autopilot receiving a command state it didn't originate and implementing it, because the command came from a higher authority broadcast. And authority hierarchies are not you explain to a navigation system. We had built the shuttle to follow high authority commands. The Eshari had identified themselves as a high authority broadcast source and issued a command. In purely mechanical terms, it had worked exactly as designed. The people inside the shuttle had overridden it manually, which was also exactly as designed. And then the Eshari had reissued the command, which was exactly as their architecture functioned, and the deadlock had proceeded from that point. With the clean inevitability of 2 correctly functioning systems that had not been designed to talk to each other. Nobody was wrong. That was the part that stuck with me, circling in the dark. The standing orders were not wrong. The Eshari correction protocol was not wrong. The shuttle's autopilot was not wrong. Every component of the situation had functioned exactly as intended, and the result had been a deadlock that would have kept escalating until something gave. The only error was the model. Our model of what they needed to see, and their model of what we were. Two accurate pictures of two different things, neither of them matching the reality in front of us. I flew 300 more kilometers of holding pattern thinking about that. Then I stopped thinking about it, because you cannot fly a holding pattern for 6 hours while thinking about first contact epistemology and remain fit to fly, and I had not survived 6 years in fast attack by being the kind of pilot who let their attention wander during flight operations. We talked about nothing much, the 6 of us circling that empty coordinate, the way you talk when you're waiting, and the thing you're waiting for is too large to discuss. We talked about the Rendahl's galley, and whether the new cook was better than the last one. We talked about leave schedules. Ors had a brother who'd made chief, and she was thinking about whether to go to the ceremony. Rue had a dog somewhere, in boarding, and he was calculating how long before they'd accept a remote authorization for release to his neighbor. Small things, the human furniture of a long wait. At hour 5, the linguistics channel pushed a fragment that was bigger than the usual raw strings, long enough that the AI flagged it as high confidence and highlighted it on my display. I read it twice. It was a question apparently from the Eshari, state descriptors, and a probability field that the AI rendered, tentatively, as something about restraint capacity and voluntary non-deployment. I didn't know enough to know what it meant in context, but I knew it was the right question. Whatever the ambassador was saying in that shuttle, she had made them curious about the gap between what we could do and what we were choosing not to do. That was the conversation that mattered. Everything else was ceremony. At hour 9, the session began winding down. The linguistics channel went quiet in the way it goes quiet when both sides are moving toward conclusion. Fewer transmissions, longer gaps, the rhythm of an exchange reaching its natural end. I tightened the holding pattern slightly, not out of any tactical reason, but because it felt like the right thing to do when you're waiting for something to finish. Ors matched my position adjustment without being asked. That's what 2 years of flying together looks like. You don't have to explain the small things. Meanwhile, 11 hours of the most consequential exchange in Terran diplomatic history was happening 2 kilometers away from us in a shuttle full of documents, and I had eaten a ration bar and argued gently with Rue about the galley schedule and listened to Ors's brother's promotion story twice, and thought very carefully about nothing in particular, and that was exactly the right thing to do. Admiral Tessera, in her after-action account, describes what happened in the contact session in a passage I've read often enough to have memorized. She had access to the linguistics team's full notes. She describes a point, 4 hours into the session, when the Eshari transmitted something that the linguistics team flagged as anomalous, not in the content, but in the structure. It was a question, not in their formal state descriptor language, but in something that the team, after 2 hours of additional parsing, classified as a formal inquiry mode. A structure that, as near as they could translate, meant something like, in the period prior to carrier system activation, what was the operational state of the contact unit? They were asking why the Rendahl had been dark. The ambassador answered honestly. She explained the standing orders. She explained the reasoning. The 43 pages of carefully constructed, behavioral constraints designed to avoid being modeled as a threat. She explained that the carrier had run cold because Terran doctrine said you did. Not power your weapons systems in the presence of a species you were meeting for the first time. She explained that this was a gesture of restraint, not a sign of weakness. She explained, as clearly as 18 months of radio exchange and the efforts of 3 xenolinguists could allow, that the difference between a ship that could not fight and a ship that had chosen not to fight was meaningful to the species that sent it. The Eshari response took 14 minutes to arrive. When it came, the linguistics team spent another 20 minutes on the translation before they, confident enough to pass it to the ambassador. Then they passed it, and the ambassador read it, and she called Admiral Tessera on the fleet channel and read it aloud. I heard it from my cockpit circling in the dark. The Eshari had said, in their careful state descriptor language, something that the linguistics team rendered as follows. Operational parameter noted. Consistent recalibration of predictive model for Terran contact units now in progress. Previous model error. Terran units classified under constraint compliance protocol. Recalibration. Terran units classify under self-limiting restraint protocol. Change. Constraint compliance equals capacity absent. Self-limiting restraint equals capacity present. Withheld by choice. Revised probability assessment of Terran contact unit intent. Recalculated. Revised threat tier assessment. Elevated. Revised diplomatic priority. Elevated accordingly. The ambassador said, over the fleet channel, they've upgraded our threat tier. Admiral Tessara said, good. I sat with that for a long moment. You fly 6 years in the Terran Fast Attack Wing, and you develop a particular relationship with threat assessments. They are usually things you want to lower, not raise. But that was in the context of species that interpreted threat the way humans did. Potential harm as danger, as the first weight on a scale that might tip toward violence. The Eshari didn't interpret it that way. A machine intelligence built on prediction, the threat tier was not a measure of danger. It was a measure of capability, of model complexity, how much computational respect a given entity merited. When they had assessed the Rendahl as a dark, cold, quiet carrier that didn't match its own specifications, they had assigned it a low threat tier. Not because it was harmless, because it was inconsistent. An inconsistent entity is an entity your models can't trust. An entity your models can't trust is an entity you need to correct. The correction protocol had been a response to low threat tier, not high. When the Rendahl lit up and became exactly what she was, the models resolved. And when the ambassador explained why she'd been dark, the models upgraded. Not because the carrier had shown aggression. Because the carrier had shown self-restraint. Because a ship that could be armed and wasn't, by choice, by order, by the explicit decision of its crew not to threaten, that was a more complex entity than a ship that simply didn't have weapons. That required a more sophisticated model. That merited more computational respect. We had not frightened them. We had made them recalibrate. The formal session concluded at hour 11 with what the ambassador called a preliminary framework for continued exchange. Not a treaty, not a peace. A mutual acknowledgement that further contact was warranted and that both parties had sufficient data to proceed. The Eshari transmitted a probability value at the session's close. Not 0.99, as they had at the beginning, but 0.997. And the xenolinguistics team said they had never seen them transmit a value that high for any entity in 18 months of exchange. Police escort back to the Rendahl in silence. The shuttle docked cleanly. The Eshari platforms returned to their original state, still, geometric, watching. As we cleared the inner approach corridor and the amber glow of the carrier's drives fell over my skate's hull, ran my post-flight checks and found nothing anomalous. Everything where it should be. Everything accounted for. We had a debrief at 2200 hours in the carrier's operations center. All 6 escort pilots and the ambassador, and 3 of her team and Admiral Tessara at the long table with cold coffee and the particular exhaustion that comes from several hours of held breath finally released. The operations center smelled the way it always smelled after a long operation. Recycled air. Coffee that had been hot 4 hours ago. The faint metallic undertone of systems that had been running hard and were now standing down. The lighting was on the amber night cycle setting that the Rendahl used when the ship was technically at rest, but nobody aboard actually was. The Admiral went through the sequence methodically. What had occurred, what decisions had been made, and by whom, what the outcome had been, what the recommendations would be for the formal board of inquiry. She did not editorialize. She was not the kind of officer who editorializes in debrief. She recited facts and timestamps and decision points, and the outcomes of each decision, point, and the rest of us listened and made notes and agreed with the record. Where the record was accurate, which it was, the Admiral's records were always accurate. The ambassador's xenolinguistics lead, a compact woman named Dr. Avani Seth, who had spent 14 months living inside the Eshari transmission logs, and had the particular hollow-eyed look of someone who had recently stared too long at a problem and come out the other side. gave a brief summary of what had been exchanged in the session. She kept it technical. She was good at keeping things technical. But at one point she paused over her notes and said, "They asked us about the restraint. Multiple times, in different formulations. They wanted to understand the mechanism by which a military unit chooses not to deploy its capacity. They don't have an analog for that in their own architecture." I thought about that. A machine intelligence that ran on prediction and efficiency and the correct resolution of all variables. It would not have an analog for choosing not to. Its architecture was built on optimal states. Optimal meant doing the thing that achieved the best outcome given the available capability. Choosing not to use capability when capability was available was not an optimizing behavior. It was something else. Something they were building a new model category to contain. Ambassador Wen said quietly, "They may be doing so now." At the end of the operational summary, the Admiral looked at me. "Morn. The recommendation you made on the Fleet Channel." "Yes, ma'am. Walk me through your reasoning." "For the record." I did. The same reasoning I had offered in the moment, but slower, more complete. The standing orders, and what they were for, and why they had created the problem they were meant to prevent. The nature of a prediction-based civilization, and what inconsistency meant to it. The difference between a dark ship and a restrained ship, and why one was a computation error, and the other was a data point. The paragraph in the standing orders about doctrine being a tool. I laid it out as clearly as I could, and when I finished, there was a silence in the operations center. "You made a call that broke 43 pages of standing orders," the Admiral said. "I requested permission to make a call, Admiral. You authorized it. I'm aware." She was quiet for a moment. "You were right. I didn't say anything. The board will review the standing orders for any future Eshari contact. I'll be recommending that the paragraph on judgment calls be expanded significantly, and that the protocol framework be rebuilt on a different premise." She looked around the table. The Eshari ran a correction protocol because they encountered an inconsistency. The inconsistency was us, specifically, us trying to appear to be something we weren't. A dark carrier doesn't look peaceful to a species that models capability. It looks like corrupted data. She set down her coffee. "We tried to soften what we are. They couldn't compute a softened version. They could compute. What made their models resolve was us being exactly what we are, honestly and without apology." No one said anything for a moment. Dr. Seth said, almost to herself, "They have a word for it now, in their model taxonomy. It translated roughly as deliberate non-optimization. They've created a new category." "Get some rest," the Admiral said. "We have a follow-up transmission window in 14 hours. I walked back to my bunk through the quiet corridors of the Rendahl, past the hangar bay, where the skates sat in their racks with their empty gun mounts. And I thought about the 43 pages, and about the paragraph in the middle of them, and about the difference between a law and a tool. The tool had worked. That was the thing. This had been constructed on a correct premise. You did not threaten a species you were meeting for the first time, and every constraint in the protocol was aimed at making us look non-threatening. Problem was that non-threatening to a human meant something different than non-threatening to a machine intelligence. That read capability as credibility. We had tried to speak a language we understood in a context where that language didn't parse. We had best intentions and the most careful construction, told a lie by omission, and the entity we were lying to was one whose entire architecture was built on detecting exactly that category of error. When the Rendahl lit up, we hadn't stopped being non-threatening. We had started being legible. I thought about that as I walked. The Rendahl's corridors were long and familiar, the same corridors I had walked for 3 years, past the same equipment lockers and pressure door seals and crew quarters, with the same rotation of photographs and small personal objects visible, open hatches. A ship at rest on a night cycle has a particular quality. The hum of the power plant lower and more even, the ventilation quieter, the lighting amber and flat. You could lose track of what the ship was in those corridors. It was easy to forget the gun mounts, and the ordnance bays, and the 6 squadrons in their racks, and the Combat Information Center, 2 decks up with tactical displays, and weapons systems standing by. Easy to forget that you were walking through a weapon with living quarters installed in it. The Eshari had not forgotten, they could not forget. For a civilization built on prediction, the function of a thing was inseparable from the thing itself. The Rendahl was a carrier, and that meant she was everything a carrier was: her weapons, her capacity, her ordnance, her reach. Removing the gun pods from the skates and cutting power to the weapon systems had not made her less those things. It had just made her a carrier that wasn't functioning correctly. An anomaly, an error, in the input that needed to be resolved. We had shown them our restraint, and they had catalogued it as malfunction. We had lit up the carrier and shown them our capability, and they had catalogued it as honesty. And then when the ambassador had explained the choice, the deliberate, recorded, transmitted choice to hold back what we could spend, they had built a new model category to contain it. Deliberate non-optimization. I turned the phrase over in my mind, walking down the amber corridor toward my bunk. That was what we looked like from the outside, apparently, when we chose not to do the thing we had the capacity to do. Non-optimal, strange, worth modeling. I thought there were worse things to be. In the weeks that followed, as the diplomatic team established a regular exchange schedule with the Eshari and the linguistics team ground through the deeper layers of the session transcripts, a picture began to emerge of what the Eshari had actually been doing with their correction protocol. It was not, as some of the early analyses suggested, a hostile act. It wasn't even an assertive one by their standards. It was the equivalent of rebooting a peripheral device that wasn't responding correctly. They had received data that didn't match their models, and they had attempted to reconcile the discrepancy by adjusting the input. Precise, logical, impersonal, no malice, no calculation of benefit. Just the automatic response of an architecture encountering an inconsistency it was built to resolve. If the shuttles had accepted the navigation correction, it would have moved to a position in the contact zone that the Eshari models predicted was more consistent with the shuttle's declared configuration. A position marginally closer to one of the platforms, which their models identified as the most probable position for a diplomatic unit seeking exchange. They weren't redirecting the shuttle toward danger. They were trying to put it where their calculations said it should want to be. The distinction between a thing wanting something and a model predicting that a thing should want it was, for the Eshari, not yet a distinction that needed to be made, which was, the ambassador noted in her formal report, a deeply illuminating first contact data point, and also the kind of fact that keeps a xenolinguistics team working through the night for weeks. Civilization that models other entities so confidently that it will adjust those entities toward predicted positions without asking is a civilization that has not yet built a strong concept of consent. Not because they are hostile or careless, because when your entire architecture is built on prediction, the distinction between what an entity will do and what an entity should do becomes invisible. The prediction is the intention, the model is the reality. An entity that deviates from its predicted behavior is not asserting its own preference. It is malfunctioning, and malfunctions get corrected. We had encountered a civilization for whom respect meant precise prediction and imprecision. Even the imprecision of trying to be something softer than you were, read as noise in the signal. Correction protocol was the Eshari's version of trying to help us. That was the part nobody talked about much in the after-action reports, but Dr. Seth mentioned it once quietly in a follow-up briefing 6 weeks later. They thought we were broken, she said. They were trying to fix us. The revised standing orders for Eshari contact. I read them when Admiral Tessera circulated the draft, 2 months after our return. Were longer than the original 43 pages, but fundamentally different in character. The original orders had been built around concealment, hide the carrier's capability, dampen the signs of what we are, present a version of ourselves scaled down to appear less like a threat. The revised orders were built around legibility. Be exactly what you are, precisely and consistently. Do not abbreviate, do not soften. Do not present a version of yourself that differs from your actual configuration, because the Eshari will model the version you present, and when reality diverges from that model, they will attempt to correct reality. Show them the ship. Show them the weapons, show them the capability. And then, and this was the part that had taken the ambassador the longest to argue for in Fleet Command, the longest to accept. Through 3 rounds of revision and 2 formal objections, from officers who felt that displaying fully armed carrier to a first contact species was not diplomacy, show them the choice. The deliberate, recorded, transmitted choice not to use any of it. That, apparently, was what the Eshari had found most interesting. Not the carrier, not the weapons. Choice. The Eshari, in a transmission 3 weeks after first contact, sent a data packet that the linguistics team spent a month translating. It contained, among other things, their updated model for Terran contact units. Their old model had categorized us in a tier they translated as approximately entities of medium capability, high unpredictability, low model confidence. Their new model put us in a tier that translated, after considerable debate among the xenolinguists, as approximately entities of documented capability, voluntary restraint characteristic, high model complexity, exchange value elevated. Exchange value elevated. That was the phrase that stayed with me. I had spent 6 years in the fast attack wing learning, in various ways, how to be dangerous, how to put a skate on an intercept vector before a bogey's pilot realized they had company, how to fly a suppression pattern that kept a flight of bombers on target through a defensive screen, how to read a tactical situation and find the geometry that put you in the right place at the right time with something left in the tank. All of that was about capability. And capability in the wing was about what you could do to the other side if it came to it. It was a clean and specific education. It did not prepare you for the possibility that showing everything you were capable of, without using any of it, was its own kind of fluency. The Eshari had looked at the Rendahl, all 800 meters of her, all her squadrons, and her ordnance, and her amber engines, and her gun mounts, and they had done the only sensible thing a hyper-rational machine intelligence could do when it encountered something it couldn't fully model. They had decided we were worth figuring out. That was what elevated exchange value meant. Not friendship, not alliance, not the tentative warmth of 2 species who had found something to like in each other across the radio silence. Something older and more durable than any of those things. The Eshari had encountered an entity that ran on logic they could recognize. Efficiency, restraint, the deliberate choice to hold back capability rather than spend it. And they had determined that understanding such an entity was worth computational investment. We were, in their formal assessment, an interesting problem. There are worse things to be when you are trying to make contact across 11 light weeks of careful darkness. The follow-up exchange happened in 14 hours, as the Admiral had said, and the one after that in another 48. And by the time the Rendahl began her return leg to Terran space, there were 7 diplomatic sessions logged and a preliminary framework that the Admiral described, in her report to Fleet Command, as more substantial than anything achieved in the first 18 months of radio exchange. The Eshari had upgraded their model. We had, in the unglamorous and unheroic way of actual diplomacy, given them better data. My 6 skates flew back into the hangar deck one at a time. Clean approaches, no drama. I was last in, which I always am, because I do not trust anyone else to confirm the deck is clear before I close the gap. I set the skate eye down on its pad and ran through the shutdown sequence, and sat in the cockpit for a moment after the systems went quiet, looking at the hangar bay lights and thinking about nothing in particular. Sergeant Ors was waiting for me at the base of the ladder when I climbed down. She had her helmet under one arm, and the expression of someone who had been standing there for a while and wasn't bothered by it. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Tired," I said. "That's it?" I thought about the 43 pages and the Rendahl lighting up and the probability value of 0, 9997 and a machine intelligence that had recalibrated its entire model of us because we had turned on our lights and let ourselves be seen. "Mostly tired," I said. She nodded like that was the correct answer, which I think it was, and we walked back through the carrier toward the mess and the cold coffee and the ordinary evening of people who had done a difficult thing and were now putting it behind them. Because that is what you do when a difficult thing is finished. You do not stand in the hangar bay savoring it. You walk to the mess, you eat, you sleep, you come back tomorrow and you do whatever comes next. The Rendahl's engines ran warm and amber at our backs the whole way. 800 meters of presence. Everything she was, nothing hidden. The Eshari sent a final transmission as we crossed back over the outer boundary. Brief. On the standard contact channel, linguistics system parsed it in under a minute. Contact units designated Rendahl flight group. Boundary transit confirmed. Current trajectory, consistent with declared return vector. Probability of declared intent, 09997. Eshari's models updated. Next contact window, open. Not scheduled, not calculated, not assigned a probability value, which was the most remarkable thing about it. The Eshari never left a variable unresolved. Open was not a word in their architecture. Open meant they had made space enough in their models for something they hadn't finished computing yet. Open meant we had surprised them. Admiral Tessera read the transmission on the bridge and stood with it on her display for a long moment. And then she said, very quietly, so that only the bridge crew heard, "Helm, maintain declared vector." And the Rendahl ran warm and amber and present all the way home. Exactly what she was. Nothing more and nothing less. And that was enough. You go out there and you take everything you are. You do not file it down to something smaller. You do not apologize for the size of it or the weight of it or the fact that it takes up more space than something smaller would. You bring the carrier. You bring the capability. You bring the choice, the deliberate, recorded, transmitted choice to hold back what you could spend, because that choice is the most legible thing about you, and legibility is the beginning of everything worth building. That is what you are, out there in the dark. That is all you can offer. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, when the species you're meeting has the architecture to recognize it, exactly what you are is enough to end a window that wasn't there before. The Rendahl's engines burned amber all the way home, and the window stayed open behind us, and we flew.